Hello everyone and welcome back to Deckled Edges. I'm your host Camilla, and today we're going to be talking about a novel with a slightly strange name, and one that definitely put me off of reading the novel when I first heard it, but I'm glad I got around to it because it's definitely one that has stuck with me for a while. I've been on a bit of a historical fiction run lately, so today we're going to be talking about a book that was first recommended to me by a stranger. Recently, I've been trying out a bit of an interesting experiment in which I try to organically come across new books that I'm going to read, and it's been working pretty well. I really enjoy seeing what strangers are reading that I come across in real life, rather than the kind of microcosm of the internet, which really just recycles the same recommendations over and over, and doesn't often give the most impactful recommendations, and often opts for more surface level common picks. So anyway, this novel's name is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. I know it's a mouthful, and it definitely is not one that I'm very keen on explaining to people that I was reading, but I came across this book because there was a woman at a cafe, and I was seated across from her in some sort of strange setup, and I noticed she was reading something, so I asked her what it was, and it happened to be this novel, and she was telling me about how she has a great appreciation for novels that are set up a little more unconventionally, and she really likes learning about this post-World War type novel. So that's definitely what piqued my interest at first. As I was doing some background research on this novel for this episode, I was noticing that there was actually a movie made about this novel back in 2018, I believe. I haven't yet seen it, but I think that's definitely an option if you are piqued by the story, but you don't necessarily want to read the book. But I definitely think it's worth reading because it is set up in an interesting way. The whole novel is told in letters, and I thought that was a really interesting choice that I've seen some authors make in the past, but not everyone does it successfully, and not everyone does it in a way that actually makes you want to engage with the story. I think that especially towards the end, the format started to make a lot more sense, and well, it made sense for the context of the novel throughout the entire book, but I really thought at the end it was used to the maximum advantage that it could be, so I really liked the way in which the author chose to employ the format. I thought that you could see a lot more perspectives than I thought you were going to be able to going into the book, and I was expecting to maybe have to kind of push through to get to the end of the book, but it really didn't feel like that. I was able to, it went down pretty nicely. It was a pretty easy read, but it really was filled with a lot of character and a lot of passion, which I really enjoyed about this novel. The first thing that I'd say is the main character, the protagonist, is a woman by the name of Juliet Ashton. She is a writer, and she writes under the name Izzy Bickerstaff. Now, Juliet is a very interesting kind of person because you have to get to know her through letters, and most notably, these letters are to her publisher and her best friend. Now, Sydney Stark is her publisher and a close friend of hers, and he is also happens to be the brother of her best friend Sophie. Now, Juliet, we get to know very quickly, is very headstrong. She has a strong personality, but she's also likable. You find her throughout the novel having to contend with parts of her character that she notices are not suited to certain people, and how she adjusts her life to fit that. She realizes that, her personality is not for everyone, but it is for some people, and she has to kind of contend with what she is willing to settle for, what she is not willing to settle for, and what she really wants in her life. Because she's written during the Second World War, she wrote under the pseudonym of Izzy Bickerstaff. She kind of wants to find her own personal writing voice, so she wants to find a topic for a new novel that she wants to work on, away from this whole concept of wartime, which she feels like is bringing her down a little bit. And in the midst of this, she is kind of lost. She doesn't have much of a direction in her life, even though she does have a pretty solid foundation, which I would say was the most important part of this novel. You see how through their letters they really care for each other, how the different characters' relationships start to develop. So I really enjoyed that part about this novel. I definitely think that you see following Juliet's journey to having a bit more direction in her life and to really finding out what she wants is really the main selling point and the thing that I most enjoyed about this book. Now, the catalyst for this whole novel is a letter, coincidentally, that she receives out of the blue from a man named Dawsey Adams on the island of Guernsey. Now, when you're reading this novel, you kind of get the impression at first, or at least I did, that Dawsey Adams is an older man. He's not. He's around Juliet's age, and that's definitely a misconception that I was pleasantly taken aback by later on, but I definitely was open to it, I think. I just was taken aback. It was almost like a plot twist that probably a lot of other people saw coming, but was definitely not something that I saw coming, because I thought he was an old guy. But it doesn't matter, because in any case, Dawsey Adams is from the island of Guernsey, as per the title of this book, and it's a farming community on an island in the English Channel between France and Britain. He's a native. He came across the name of the writer, Juliet, inside a book by Charles Lamb. This Lamb fellow becomes very significant, not really as a character, but just Dawsey is very Charles Lamb-esque. I don't know who Charles Lamb was, but that is definitely something used to describe his character a lot. He is very dedicated to this man, and therefore he is very dedicated to Juliet being in possession, or the original owner of this book by Charles Lamb. And since books are scarce, a scarcity on Guernsey, and many things are a scarcity on Guernsey after the war, he would like more, especially after he learns that Juliet is a writer who happens to be in possession of access to plenty of books, as is typical of an author. But in any case, the topic of his rather unusual book club, the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, comes up. Now, these letters are surprisingly heartfelt. It's very wholesome. I think that's the vibe that you get throughout this whole book. It's a very wholesome book. But it's also quite complex, which I was pleasantly surprised about. Not necessarily in a plot way. I feel like the plot is definitely not cut and dry, but definitely minced. You know what I mean? But I was surprised by the complexity of the characters that we got to find. And I think that was definitely the appeal of this book. It is, more of a feel-good novel, but it also has some serious soul-searching that the characters have to do. I mean, honestly, the more I talk about it, the more I just gush about how endearing this book is. I think the characters are just so likable, especially through their correspondence. Everyone wants to get to know Juliet, and Juliet is very open. Like I was saying, she's in need of direction in her life. She needs a new topic for her next novel. She needs to find her personality as a writer independent of a pseudonym. And honestly, she just, she's in her 30s. She is kind of navigating that. Does she want to settle down? It is revealed that she was previously engaged, but as we learn, she knows that maybe something wasn't right for her, and she's never really felt understood and liberated in the way that she would like to be. Not really, maybe that was the wrong word, but more so have that ability to live her life in a certain manner that isn't consistent with the London lifestyle that she has been living through. So she doesn't really necessarily go into this novel wanting a change, but I think what is so impactful is how she sweetly begins to realize that she really did need a change, more so than want one. And so, in any case, through the letters of other islanders that we come to know and love, such as Isola, which is a dear name who is very prone to obsession with new, not necessarily hobbies, but interests in the area of magic, but not really magic, just fake magic. But it kind of does have an impact on the novel too, which I thought is so cute. The little things and quirks of the islanders are really incorporated into the storyline and made endearing and attractive to the reader. Now, as to how this book club / literary society came about, there's definitely an interesting backstory to it, which is what initially drew Juliet in. She kind of felt this spark, at least to the reader, it was very clear that she felt this spark that she had been missing, even though she didn't know it yet. there was something so intriguing about this name that really is quite uncommon. It's really not common at all for a book to have a name even as close to as long as this one, but I think it could turn some people away, but because it's not catchy, but it has its own appeal that I really have grown to appreciate as the novel went on. So basically, even in the early stages of the novel, before we really get to know the characters, we're made to realize that this character, Elizabeth McKenna, is important. She's a young woman who lived on Guernsey and was really the catalyst for the formation of the society, for this bringing together of a hodgepodge of characters that really have no business being in one space together. And I think that is the common theme of these books that I have been enjoying lately. Both this one and In Between Shades of Grey involve, in very different circumstances, mind you, but surprisingly around the same time, circumstances with which random groups of people that have no business being together are brought together and forced to forge a sense of community and to support each other and grow to be this kind of found family, even within different, certainly very different, but unique situations. Now, we learn that because of German occupation on Guernsey, one night there was a get-together because during these times of dreariness, there was a pig roast in which a bunch of random people were invited to get together and roast a pig, and that by fortune happened to die, and they, as they were going out, they were caught past the curfew on the island. Now, what's significant about this was not only was it the formation of the Guernsey Literary Society, but Elizabeth McKenna was the one to come up with this lie to explain to the officer that, the reason that they were out past curfew was because they were in a book club, which is something that, as we're told, is made clear to the reader, is not a very foolproof lie, but was something so brilliant and made up on the spot that it really encompasses Elizabeth McKenna's personality and how she's able to adapt and be this kind of beacon for the people of Guernsey. And not only that, but also we're able to kind of believe this because we're told that the German soldiers at this time they were also stuck on Guernsey as well. There was nowhere for them to go, and maybe it wasn't the most believable that they were having a book club, but it makes sense that people need an outlet in a dark time. And so maybe it was realistic that there would be a sort of strange curiosity as a book club on a farming community. Now, as with any good lie, there has to be some truth to it, so they were forced to follow through. And it was definitely an interesting thing to learn about, because you're learning about it through the letters just as Juliet is, and it's really kind of an interesting perspective because you get to be flipping between the perspectives of learning the information from multiple sources. You're learning the story of Guernsey from Dawsey and Isola and John Booker and all these other characters, but you're also learning about Juliet's life through her perspective, her letters to Sophie and Sidney Stark. And you really get this full picture of these characters and how they interact with others, and you kind of start to know what they want before they even know it themselves. You realize that certain characters, Juliet later on has a love plot with a man by the name of Mark Reynolds. Now, from the beginning, because you're getting these interesting perspectives through the letters, and it's not in the normal prose format, you kind of understand these characters through a different lens. Mark Reynolds initially starts trying to court Juliet by sending her anonymous flowers. I can't remember if they were anonymous or not, but I think initially they were. And ultimately, Juliet finds out and goes to the source and meets this man, and he makes his intentions clear, and they start courting. Now, this is an interesting matchup because you realize from the beginning that it was because of his persistence, not necessarily her willingness, that they first met, which is not a necessarily bad thing, but you begin to realize that perhaps this mystique that he was attempting to maintain throughout the whole process by, sending flowers and gaining her attention rather than her admiration or respect, was not necessarily a match that was framed to be the ideal one. And even as the relationship goes on, through her letters to Sydney and her letters to Sophie, we see that she is unsettled by the prospect of staying with this man forever. And, it's not her first relationship, nor is it her first serious relationship in which she contemplates marriage. It's not something that we see to Juliet is off the table. But we realize that not only through her just sheer personality, but also through her connection to Guernsey and her willingness to go and learn, and her fondness of her new friends whom she's never met but she wants to so deeply, we start to see that Mark is more of a inhibitor to her happiness and to her freedom and to her willingness to explore and to maybe break free of this society that she's currently in. And we start to get a little more uncomfortable, even though maybe the prospect of Mark wasn't that unattractive to begin with. It's not that he was a bad person. It was simply that he was wrong for Juliet, and I think that that is very tenderly handled. And we also get to see that, throughout the story, we get to see a little more of her past, which is almost like a nice present, because we see this character and we see how she is currently. We know that, they all went through the war and they all had to deal with London in the war, which was obviously bombed heavily. However, we also don't know much about Juliet personally, her experiences beyond just being a writer and being headstrong. And so when we learn that she was previously engaged to a man who has died, his name was Lieutenant Rob Dartry, and we see her contemplate this regret of maybe he was a good man in her eyes, but she felt that he wasn't right for her because they had a fight, and he was not as willing to understand and attempt to meet her in the middle and attempt to really try to get to know why she loves books so much. And this was definitely like an alienating factor for them, and ultimately why their relationship didn't work out. However, we also, through this experience, we're solidified in the idea that Juliet's relationship with Mark will likely not work out, especially after he proposes marriage to her, because it seems sudden and it seems jarring, even though perhaps, and it is because they hadn't been dating for very long, but it doesn't seem like they're even at a comfortable point to even keep dating rather than just let alone marriage. But truly, we get to know that Juliet is a certain way with the people who she holds dear to her, and she's just not that way with Mark. Enough rambling about the relationship, because what's really important is her relationship with her friends that she meets on Guernsey. Now, she receives many other correspondence letters through members of the society, and this is all in the first part of the novel, which in and of itself almost feels like a fleshed out story. Even before she reaches Guernsey, we're able to get to know these characters so well, and I really admire that about this novel, because it's a very difficult thing to pull off, I feel like, especially just through letters. You're basically self-reporting on yourself. You can't really tell personality through a self-report, but it is possible, as demonstrated by this novel, because not only do we get Juliet's second hand, so we're like the third read of these letters, and we also get like a third interpretation, because not only do we get the primary letters from, for example, from Eben to Juliet, but we also get Juliet's reaction to those letters to Sydney, and after that we get to read it. So it's almost like a chain of understanding, and each understanding level reveals more information and more personality, and that's just the nice thing that I appreciated about it. It's almost like a hot potato, like, not to make a pun on the name, which, by the way, is only called potato peel pie because one of them baked a potato peel pie and it kind of stuck. But you know what? I appreciate it because it's just the kind of thing that I feel like if you're going to have a clandestine, random book club on German-occupied islands, then it definitely has to have an eclectic name, so I appreciate that. Furthermore, I think it's just really interesting how it is a book club, so you get to know the islanders through the books that they chose, and not all of some of them will have diverse tastes, but definitely some, such as Eben, will explain how they weren't enthusiastic about reading at all until they discovered Shakespeare through the club, and how, through that, he gets to be more vulnerable with Juliet and tells him about his grandson who was evacuated from Guernsey before the Germans invaded, and how, he felt that loneliness and that doubt about whether it was the right decision to separate him. But in addition, you also see other characters such as John Booker saying he only reads the letters of Seneca, and you just get these quirks, you get this feel, and you almost understand why Juliet would want to feel this compulsion, would feel such a compulsion to visit these people, because they become like your friends, they become like your companions who have this whole separate life from you, but you're jealous that you're not there, and I understand that about Juliet. Definitely the most central character that doesn't make an appearance is Elizabeth McKenna. She is someone that you learn about and is the common thread, and I think that this is such a significant part of this novel, that Elizabeth McKenna is the common thread. And this is something that Juliet later realizes, and this is what she decides to... She has this revelation, this epiphany, that this is the common thread that she needs to write this book. This new topic, her topic will be Guernsey and these people that she met, and her thread, her anchor will be McKenna. And that's such an interesting realization. It's just such a... It feels like something that you subconsciously knew the whole time, and maybe you even consciously knew the whole time, but it just feels like a nice wrap up, and it feels like Juliet's reckoning with herself and her arc and what she's going to really do justice to these people of Guernsey. It just feels like a very nice package with the bow on top. And I really appreciated that about this novel. It didn't feel like any ends were left loose. It felt like a nice hug at the end. And so to give context on Elizabeth, she was a young girl on Guernsey. She came to Guernsey as a young girl, and she obviously grew into a young woman. Her mother worked for Sir Ambrose, another tangential character in the story, but she was wild. She befriended Eben's daughter Jane, and she returned to the island right before the invasion to close up Sir Ambrose, one of the wealthier individuals on Guernsey's house, and she chose to stay because she liked it, and Jane was pregnant and on bed rest to Eben's daughter. And this kind of starts to show you the connections between the people on Guernsey, and, how they are so intertwined and dear to each other. So Elizabeth's friend Jane, she died when the Germans bombed Guernsey, and Elizabeth became a nurse. And there are plenty more examples of how she was so entwined with the lives of the Guernsey people, but she fell in love with a German soldier by the name of Christian Hellman. Now, the interesting thing is that everyone speaks well of Christian, but there's definitely contention in this novel as to whether Elizabeth was a good person for this. However, the people that she was friends with and closest to understand that, and all attest to Christian's good nature and good, just being a good person overall, and they all hold Elizabeth in such high regard that there's no doubt in their minds that she was good. And it's really just such a central topic in this book, how after Christian and Elizabeth fell in love, they had a daughter named Kit. And a few months before Kit was born, Christian was sent to work in a hospital in France by the Germans, and he died. So not only was there this tragedy that occurred to Elizabeth and her daughter, her unborn daughter, obviously, but she was forced to kind of keep moving forward and keep going because they were in wartime. But after the birth of their child, in 1944, Elizabeth was imprisoned, and she was sent to the mainland for helping one of the tote workers, or the imprisoned workers, who came to Guernsey to do physical labor. And none of the people in the society had any idea where she was now, and they had not heard anything about her whereabouts, so they were all understandably very worried about her, and there was just this mystery around the whole situation that persisted through the novel until it got a conclusion, basically. But it just goes to show how central of a character Elizabeth is, even in her absence, how she was not only the foundation for the literary society, but she was so intertwined in the lives of not only Eben, whose daughter she was best friends with, but John Booker, who impersonated his employer, Lord Tobias, and she was the one who came up with that plan so that he could stay on Guernsey and, live the life that he wanted. And he was just such a big part of their lives. And even through Kit, she was vicariously a part of their lives because they all took upon them the collective responsibility of raising her daughter as if she was their own. And that's such an important thing to note about the community that was founded on Guernsey, and these literary society that became a family that banded together to become parents for this child who had none, who was an orphan after just truly unfortunate circumstances as a result of the war. And this is something that Juliet is privy to now, and something that becomes impossible for her to leave behind. In addition, another thing that I think added to this intrigue that Juliet had about Dawsey is that he had a central role in raising Kit. This was he took it upon himself to be the best father figure that he could for Kit and really allow her to flourish as a unique person that mirrored some of the best traits of her mother. In the second half of this book, as I've been discussing back and forth, truly, to be honest with you, throughout this episode, Juliet actually takes a trip to Guernsey. Now, this is where everything kind of comes together. All these characters, all these personalities that we have been acquainted with throughout the course of the first half of the novel come together and really are showcased how they interact with each other and the dynamics that are preserved through the letters. Now, the important part about this part of the novel, I really truly believe, is the ways in which I feel like there are a lot of subplots that kind of take place in the second half. We see Remy, who is a survivor of a concentration camp that became friends with Elizabeth, and she brings the bad news, the awful news that Elizabeth is dead. And this is such a heart-wrenching confirmation for the people on Guernsey that you kind of feel as a reader, because you hold out this hope that perhaps Kit isn't an orphan and that this central member of their lives would be returned safe and sound. But unfortunately, it brings to you this reality that you really start to understand that, the circumstances, no matter if it's a novel or not, no one really has the plot armor that is often customary of normal fiction novels. It's not true in that sense, where it's historical fiction, so the history must take place. But I'd say that this is more of a subplot, and it just brings some closure on the idea that Elizabeth might be alive. But it also, we get to see another character, a new character, Remy, that provides an interesting addition to the dynamic, I would say, because she has experiences that truly none of the people, no matter how lovable and likable the characters are, could really ever understand. So it just is an interesting idea to introduce how these characters contend with this unexplainable tragedy that occurred to this person that none of them can relate to. But they also share the grief of Elizabeth, so I believe that, it doesn't become awkward, but it is just an interesting dynamic that can be at times complicated. In addition, you obviously also have the love plot that's being carried out between temporarily Juliet and Mark, and then later Juliet and someone else, which I'll let you guess. But I think that is one of the more sweet parts of the novel. I think you really get to see, it kind of rushed together at the end, and it does feel quite fast, but it also feels slow at the same time, which is obviously a paradox, but I think it will make sense if you read the novel, and it just feels very sweet to me in the book. I don't know if they captured that in the movie, but even though at the end it feels kind of fast, it's very understandable, and it's sweet, and it's kind of taken its time to quietly grow, which is something that I really appreciated, even if, it was in sort of an interesting circumstance, But there's also a random plot point about Oscar Wilde, and honestly, I wasn't quite sure why that was in the novel, but I kind of liked it. It was an interesting, I don't know, I wouldn't discredit the novel because of it. I thought it was an interesting addition, and honestly, it just was kind of another light-hearted adventure for the gang to go on. No, I mean, the group on Guernsey. It was just an interesting literary addition. But truly, I really liked the second part of the novel. I think it wrapped everything up very nicely, and I think it really proved how you can pull off a novel that has complicated ideas and not always lighthearted themes, and also use an unconventional writing style and execute it in such a way that makes it wholesome and makes it a light, interesting read, and not necessarily what I've come to expect out of certain historical fiction. I really liked it. I thought that the second part of the book did a good job at wrapping up all the ends of the characters. I think that the character development was something I really enjoyed about this novel. If anything, read this book for the characters. I think they're so sweet, and at times, it's just it's almost coming of age, but later on in life. It was very, an interesting dissection of how the war kind of make time stop for a lot of people, and how they have to put on hold finding themselves, and they have to put on hold certain aspects of their lives for this greater global phenomenon, when in reality, life has to go on, and there is a other side to grief, I think was also an important topic highlighted in this book. But overall, I thought this was a really, really solid read, and definitely not something I was expecting from a title such as The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, but I'm really happy that I chose to stick with this book. And even if it's not your cup of tea, I think there's definitely good things to be taken away from this novel. So thank you so much for listening. I'm really glad that you guys decided to tune in again. This was Deckled Edges. I'm your host, Camilla, and I hope you had a really exciting, relaxing time with me here today, and I hope you found another good book to read, as is always my goal. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.